So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jenks Center online programming. Let's just do a little bit of light housekeeping. If you'd like to sign up for our e-newsletter happenings, you can go to our website listed here in white and sign up. I also would like to ask you to participate in our online survey, which will come after tonight's presentation. So in January, we did have Composer's Corner. We're going to put that on our YouTube and share that with people. Of course, this evening's program, we also have Acrylics for the Aspiring Painter. That's with Eli Portman. That will be on January 23rd and January 30th. If you can only make it to one, remember that we will be recording these so that you could watch them at a later date. Also, we have Virtual The Many Faces of Meryl Streep with Deborah Block. I was just talking to Deborah today. She's really excited to present this. She says we're really going to enjoy that. So I recommend that you sign up for these programs early. So in February, we have in-person Top to Toe, the history of clothing with Diane Therese. So far that is going to be in person. That is on the 1st of February, Virtual Composer's Corner with Dr. Elizabeth Austin. And that will be on the 8th. We have in-person Valentine's Day Traditions in Boston with Anthony Samarco, and that's on the 15th. We have virtual Chinese New Year celebration with Jennifer Zhang on the 22nd. Also, we're going to have some footage of my Tai Chi class during that hour. So I would like to thank the Cummings Foundation for their generous grant for tonight's event. I'd also like to thank Philip Belts, our director. Okay, also like to, oh, it says I'm muted again. Okay. I'd like to thank Philip Belts, the director, Maria Rutnam for our WSA manager, Nick Asaro, who's our facilities manager. We have Vicki Druggis, who's the administrative secretary, Kathleen Schneller, our administrative coordinator, Sue Clark, transportation coordinator, Patty Santos, senior clerk, Suzanne Norton, social worker, Colleen Wages, our registered nurse. I'd also like to thank Erica for all of her efforts in getting us the grant. And she's also here this evening, so if everyone would just give her a little thank you. Thank you so much. And
they heard me.
No, I think they did.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to introduce Richard. So one moment, let's get him pinned. Here he is. Okay, spotlight for everyone. There we go. So thank you so much for coming back and joining us. We're so delighted to have you here this evening. So this is Richard Smith. He has been a Concord historian for over 20 years. He studied the life of Henry Thoreau since moving to Concord in 1999 and has successfully performed as Thoreau throughout New England. Try saying that 3 times fast, right? And around the country. Richard is the current scholar in residence for the Longfellow's Wayside Inn in Sudbury and has written 6 books for Applewoods of Carlisle, Massachusetts. So thank you. We're all so pleased that you're with us this evening.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is my 3rd program for the Jenks Center. And someday we'll actually get to do it in person. But it's actually a pleasure to be here this evening. And wow, look at how many people are joining me. I'm really honored that you decided to spend your Tuesday night with me. So the lecture that I'm going to give tonight, actually, I first gave in 2008. Way back when for the Thoreau Society. I have since dusted it off and revamped it and reworked it and added a bunch of new stuff. So you are going to hear it relatively brand new for the very first time. And this is about Henry Thoreau's first year at Walden Pond, 1845 to 1846. So I'm going to read the lecture, and then we will then open it up to Q&A. And by all means, if you have any questions, just ask it in the chat box down there at the bottom of your screen. So let's begin. July 5th, 1845, yesterday I came here to live. With those words written in his journal, the 27-year-old Henry Thoreau began his 2-year sojourn at Walden Pond. This has become one of the most researched, pondered over, studied, and influential events in American literary history. Today, many people believe that Thoreau's experiment at Walden was the main event of his life, and in truth, most people know little else about him. He is the guy who lived in a cabin. His essays, his anti-slavery activities, his scientific studies, his home life with his family, his sisters, mother, and father, all of these are overshadowed by his stay at Walden Pond. And many non-Thoreauvians are surprised when they learn that he spent only 2 years there. Many assume that he lived there all of his life. What is it about Thoreau's life at Walden that we find so interesting? Why does his experiment have such a hold on our imagination? More importantly, what was it like not only for him, but for his contemporaries? How did Thoreau's friends and neighbors see his experiment? What are the facts of Thoreau's life at Walden, and what is fiction? We've heard this comment many times. Thoreau was a hermit at Walden Pond. Of all the mythology and stories that surround him, this one story is the most persistent. And no matter how much Thoreauvians protest, the story continues to circulate. I even had a teacher say to me once, you know, Thoreau was a hypocrite. He told everyone he was a hermit, but he came home every day to get his laundry done. It should be obvious to anyone who's read Walden that Thoreau was not a hermit. Just the chapter called Visitors is enough to put that myth to rest. So the question in my mind is not so much was he or was he not a hermit, but more importantly, how did the rumor start in the first place? In Walden itself, Thoreau declares, quote, I am naturally no hermit. So if someone tells me Thoreau was a hermit, I'm inclined to suspect that this person hasn't really read Walden very closely. Almost from the very beginning of his sojourn, Thoreau had visitors. I think that the most frequent visitor in those first months was probably Ralph Waldo Emerson. After all, it was Emerson's land that Thoreau was living on. To be precise, it was Emerson's woodlot. I would think that he'd be quite curious as to know what exactly Thoreau was doing, not only on his land, but what he was doing to it as well. After purchasing about 14 acres of land on the northeast side of the pond in the autumn of 1844, Emerson became quite attached to his new holdings. He called the woodlot, quote, my garden, and wrote to Thomas Carlyle that his new land holding was, quote, the best plaything I ever had. Emerson, along with his family, made frequent, almost daily excursions to the woodlot. And it was about a mile and a half walk from Emerson's house. Any visitor to Emerson's home was more than likely treated to a walk out to Waldo's new property. Historian Barksdale Maynard wrote that the woodlot was a central feature of Emerson's life. So naturally, I think that Emerson would want to stop by on occasion to see what Thoreau was up to, at least during Thoreau's first year there. By the second year, Emerson was too busy preparing a book of poetry for publication, as well as planning an upcoming trip to England to stop by so often. But in that first year, Thoreau was expected to make some improvements while at the pond, the main chore being to clear the land of overgrown shrubs and brambles. Ellery Channing called the land Thoreau lived on the briars, and the place where Thoreau planned to plant his beans was a fairly wild, tangled area. In exchange for rent, Thoreau set to work clearing some of the land about a month before moving into his house on July 4th, 1845. So Emerson got his land cleared and Thoreau got beans. The arrangement suited them both. Along with Emerson, Thoreau's other friends went to see him at the pond, including the Alcotts and the Hawthorns. But his most frequent visitor was probably his best friend, Ellery Channing. In fact, Channing lived with Henry for 2 weeks in the fall of 1845, sleeping on the floor next to Thoreau's bedstead. Emerson even commented on the living arrangements, wryly saying, quote, "Ellery lives with Henry Thoreau at the pond in the absence of his wife." I think that Channing was probably at the Walden house more than any of Thoreau's friends, so much so that he is mentioned more than any other person in the book. Channing is the poet in both the Winter Visitors and the Brute Neighbors chapters in Walden. Having a wife and children, Ellery was probably more than a little jealous of his friend's freedom at the pond. They were the same age and both were viewed with suspicion around Concord as lazy layabouts. There is no doubt the two of them had a great time at the pond. Thoreau even says that there were, quote, "regular salutes of laughter at his home whenever Ellery visited." For all of his faults, and there were a lot, Ellery was a lot of fun to be around, and he made Thoreau laugh a lot. And the two friends, no doubt, reveled in their image as outsiders and Concord ne'er-do-wells. Strangers, too, stopped by to see Thoreau, and he lists all of the honest pilgrims that he saw. He mentions a visit from a simple-minded pauper, as well as visits from half-witted men from the almshouse. So obviously, he was far from alone at Walden. How was it that he became known as a hermit? Some of it comes from Thoreau himself. He calls himself a hermit in the book, and of course this was done tongue-in-cheek, but many read Walden literally, perhaps too literally in this case. Also over the years, Thoreau's intentions have been misunderstood. Yes, he wanted to live a solitary life, but students and teachers of Thoreau have confused solitary with secluded. Henry was alone a lot, but he was never secluded. He was only a mile or so from Concord Center, and there were 2 roads near his Walden house. Many who think Thoreau was secluded are often shocked when they actually see the site where Thoreau was living, because it is not some lonely hermitage deep in a primeval forest. But in the 19th century, Walden Woods was on the fringe of polite Concord society. To Thoreau's friends and neighbors, he probably did seem secluded. Bronson Alcott even went so far as to call Thoreau's house a hermitage. To proper Concordians, all of whom lived a so-called civilized life, Thoreau's sojourn at Walden was strange and nonconformist. They probably saw Thoreau on a less frequent basis than his family and friends, so to them, he was a hermit, and his life at Walden was just eccentric enough to warrant suspicion and, of course, gossip. Thoreau was already considered an outsider and a ne'er-do-well, a Harvard graduate who was doing nothing with his degree or his career. I can just hear the Concord gossips now. Quote, "You'll never guess what Cynthia Thoreau's lazy David Henry is up to now." And these sorts of rumors have persisted over the years, driven no doubt by Concordians. I have noticed, however, that those who insist that Henry was a hermit are usually the ones who don't like his writings or are out to discredit him somehow for being some sort of transcendental hypocrite. But real Thoreauvians know better. Thoreau's reasons for going to the pond were twofold. In Walden, he is annoyingly vague, and he tells his readers that he went to the pond to, quote, "transact some private business." Well, that private business was to write what would become his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. In fact, Thoreau had been contemplating both writing the book and living in a pond for several years. The idea to live by a pond probably germinated when he spent 6 weeks in the summer of 1835 living with his Harvard classmate, Charles Stearns Wheeler, in a one-room shanty that Wheeler built near Flint's Pond in Lincoln, Massachusetts, not too far from Walden. That vacation stuck with Thoreau, and by the 1840s, it seems that he was dead set on living by a pond, and it didn't necessarily have to be Walden. He tried to buy land near Flint's Pond. Although the deal fell through, he never gave up on the idea. In 1841, he wrote in his journal, quote, "I only ask for a clean seat. I will build my lodge on the southern slope of some hill." And later that year he added, "I want to go soon and live away by the pond where I shall hear only the wind whisper among the reeds." Friends and acquaintances knew his plans as well. Margaret Fuller even wrote to Thoreau and asked him to, quote, "let me know whether you go to the lonely hut." With no steady job and little income, Thoreau's life seemed to be going nowhere until Ralph Waldo Emerson purchased those 14 acres on the shore of Walden Pond in 1844. Within a year, he had invited Thoreau to live there, build a house, and write, all rent-free. All Thoreau had to do was clear some land for Emerson and replant the trees he cut down. Other than that, Thoreau was free to, as his friend Ellery Channing put it, devour himself alive. Perhaps because it was Emerson's land that he was living on, perhaps is one reason why Thoreau had gained the dubious reputation for being a squatter. Thoreau calls himself a squatter, in fact, throughout the book, and again, this is done tongue-in-cheek. He wasn't squatting, however. He did have Emerson's permission to live there after all. But interestingly enough, at no place in Walden does Thoreau ever mention Emerson by name, nor does he ever thank Emerson for his generosity. In fact, the only mention of Emerson comes near the end of the Winter Visitors chapter. He refers to Emerson as, quote, one other with whom I had solid seasons, who looked in upon me from time to time. That's all. Had Thoreau and Emerson had their falling out by the time Thoreau wrote those lines, or was he squeamish about appearing to sponge off of Emerson's fame? Regardless, one fact is certain. If it were not for Emerson's generosity in letting Thoreau live on his Walden property, Henry's experiment, and for that matter, the writing of either of his books, probably would not have happened as they did. Emerson looms large in not only the Thoreau legend, but in fact as well. Over the years, Thoreau's detractors have somehow come to believe that because it was Emerson's land and not Thoreau's, that Henry was sponging off of Emerson or somehow taking advantage of him. I attribute this to the fact that in the 19th century, Emerson's reputation very much eclipsed Thoreau's. To many, Thoreau was just an Emerson disciple, or worse, a copycat. Emerson was the man in Concord, while Thoreau was a lazy ne'er-do-well who never amounted to anything. So naturally, some would easily make the assumption that the lazy copycat was somehow sponging off of the famous sage of Concord for those 2 years. Make no mistake, Thoreau went to Walden with Emerson's blessings. At first, the older and more practical Emerson did have some doubts about Thoreau's intentions. And it was about this time that he even wrote in his journal, quote, cultivated people cannot live in a shanty. But I believe that Emerson did eventually come around to see Thoreau's point of view. He later journalized while sitting in his huge house on the Cambridge Turnpike, quote, is not a small house the best? Thus, Thoreau finally accomplished his long-held goal to live by a pond. But what about his other ambition to write a book? This too was accomplished in the 2 years at Walden Pond. We know that Thoreau went to Walden primarily to work on A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. Most non-Thoreauvians assume he was at Walden to write Walden, but it was his first book that brought Henry to the pond in 1845. He'd been contemplating the book for a few years, ever since his brother John, with whom he'd made the river excursion in 1839, had died of lockjaw. Thoreau's journal of 1842 to 1844 is filled with ideas and observations that eventually found their way into his first book. Particularly because of John's death in 1842, Thoreau's ideas about writing the book seemed to finally crystallize, and moving to the pond was just the catalyst that he needed in order to make the book a reality. Originally entitled A Chit-Chat with Nature, which I'm really glad is not the title of the book, Thoreau completed the first draft of the book within his first year at the pond. This draft of the book, while not radically different,
he seems to be frozen. There you go. We lost some of that, Richard. We lost some of that. You were frozen on this end.
Oh, sorry. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. Let's see. The overall outline of the book seemed clear to Thoreau from the very start. The 13-day voyage up the Concord and Merrimack rivers was chronicled by each chapter being titled as a day of the week. But Thoreau had not yet shortened the excursion to just a week, and the first draft chronicled 14 days, starting with August 31st, 1839, and ending with September 13th. It should be noted that missing from the draft, just as in the final published version of a week, was the Thoreau brothers' side trip to the White Mountains. Like all of Thoreau's published writings, a week started out as a series of observations and ideas in his journal. Indeed, 3/4 of his journal for 1845 to 1846 are passages that eventually found their way into the book. Interestingly enough, Thoreau kept scanty records of the excursion up the river while it was actually happening. Most of a week was written after the fact, 6 or 7 years later, while the actual writing of the book was started only when Thoreau began living at the pond in July of 1845. There are several passages that originally were in a week that for some reason or another Thoreau deleted but used later in Walden. In particular, there is a section about fashion, quote, "When the soldier is hit by a cannonball, rags are as becoming as purple," as well as some commentary on tattooing, quote, "It is not the hideous custom it is described to be," both of which Thoreau cut from a week but put into Walden a few years later. But what I find most interesting of all is a paragraph that Thoreau took out of a week. It is one of his most famous passages, familiar to students and non-students of Thoreau alike, and it reads, quote, "It is the sum of all wisdom not to do desperate things. The great mass of mankind lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. From the desperate city, you go into the desperate country and have to console yourself with the bravery of minks and muskrats." Of course, this passage has garnered Thoreau much acclaim since it first appeared in Walden in 1854. It is one of the few passages that many people seem to know, even if they don't know that it was written by Thoreau. It appears on posters, refrigerator magnets, and greeting cards, and Lives of Quiet Desperation has almost become Thoreau's motto. But I wonder if Thoreauvians and scholars would have had such a special place in their hearts for this passage if Thoreau had kept it in his not so well-known first book instead of placing it in his later masterpiece. So as we can see, the 2 years at the pond were arguably the 2 most productive years of Thoreau's literary life. He produced not 1, but 2 drafts of a week at the pond. He also wrote a lecture about Thomas Carlyle, which he delivered before the Concord Lyceum in February 1846, and he later expanded that lecture into a 2-part essay that was published in Graham's Monthly Magazine early in 1847. That first year, Thoreau also wrote another lecture, which he called A History of Myself. This was the piece that was destined to become Walden after 8 years and 7 drafts. Thoreau would give that lecture in the winter of 1847-1848, first in nearby Lincoln, Massachusetts, and then in Concord. Yes, as shocking as it may seem, Concordians were not the first ones to hear the words that eventually became Walden. That distinction goes to their neighbors in Lincoln. Thoreau delivered A History of Myself in the town on January 19th, 1847, but didn't read it in Concord until a month later, which is tomorrow. The anniversary is tomorrow. If we take a peek into Thoreau's second year at Walden, we can see what else he wrote. The second draft of a week and an essay about Mount Katahdin. And don't forget, he also wrote in his journal every single day. So in a strictly literary sense, Thoreau was far from lazy while living at the pond. Now, I just have one aside. Some historians seem to think that Thoreau wrote Resistance to Civil Government, aka Civil Disobedience, while living at the pond, but I don't think so. Henry went to jail in July of 1846, and his journal for that year has a few sketchy ideas that were eventually used in his lecture and essay about civil disobedience. He rails against the Mexican War, calling it one of the worst crimes ever committed since time began. He complains about the jailer or constable being a tool of the state, but that's about it. The rest of the journal for 1846 into 47 is filled with more ideas for a week, as well as entries that we recognize in Walden. But there's nothing else in there about the war or jails or even about taxes. Unfortunately, very little of Thoreau's journal from the period still exists, so there's no paper trail showing the evolution of resistance to civil government, like we have for Walden or Walking or many of Thoreau's other essays. On August 31st, 1846, Thoreau left the pond for a 2-week excursion to Maine, an event that he even alludes to in Walden. The journal for the fall of 46 is almost entirely about that trip, which was then worked into a lecture, an excursion to Katahdin, which was started at the pond but finished after he left in September 1847, and he delivered it in Concord in January 1848. This lecture, as well as parts of a week and a history of myself, were all taken from his journal entries at that time. But there are no entries from this period that ended up in resistance to civil government. And I see no evidence in the journals or elsewhere that Thoreau started a lecture while living at Walden. He was simply too busy with his other projects at the time and probably did not start the lecture until the fall of 1847. After he left the pond and moved into Emerson's house. Another myth that is materialized about Thoreau's incarceration, I should add, concerns Emerson visiting Thoreau while in jail. As the story goes, and most of you know it, Thoreau came to see Thoreau that night asking, "Henry, why are you in jail?" To which Thoreau cheekily replies, "Waldo, why are you out of jail?" Simply put, this never happened. This never happened. There is no basis for the story, especially from either Emerson or Thoreau. In fact, Emerson probably did not know about Thoreau's incarceration until after the fact, and was probably told the next day by Bronson Alcott after Thoreau had been released. Thoreau and Emerson biographer, the late great Bob Richardson, even went so far as to say, quote, "There is no basis for that story." In 1894, Sam Staples, the man who arrested Thoreau, even went so far as to say that the event never happened, that Emerson could not have seen Thoreau in jail because he arrested Henry at sundown, and that the jail was soon locked up for the night. So the story seems to have originated with Thoreau's Aunt Maria, who told it to various people in the 1890s, and some of them took the old lady's recollections at face value. Now, over the years, it has become gospel, this story, and it's even the centerpiece of a Vietnam War era stage production entitled The Night Thoreau Spent in Jail. That play has been studied by thousands of students since 1970, and it has done more to propagate the jail story than anything else. But one would think, however, that Staples, more than anyone else, would have known if Emerson was there that night or not, so his story, in my mind, is the most plausible. Considering the literary work that he did while at Walden, I don't think that Thoreau had such a productive literary 2 years ever again. It's no wonder that Channing called the house a wooden inkstand. Along with his writings, Thoreau accomplished a lot of other things at the pond as well. So consider this. In the first year alone, he built a house, he cleared 2.5 acres of land and planted those acres with beans, potatoes, corns, peas, and turnips and beets. The bean rows themselves, according to Thoreau, would have been approximately 7 miles long if he laid them end to end. And according to Barksdale Maynard, that's over 20,000 bean plants. It's no wonder that Thoreau wrote in August of 1845, quote, "I will not plant beans another summer." But this was a lie. The next year he did plant beans, but only about 1/3 of an acre. He also grew tomatoes, squash, corn, and potatoes, most of which were lost during a freak-killing frost in June of 1846. As well as farming, Henry would go into Concord and do other work while living at the pond, like surveying, carpentry, and day labor of various and other kinds, including the building of a fence for Emerson. In the first 8 months alone, Thoreau earned $13.34 with his hands, $10 of which came from Emerson. Of course, he didn't work every day. He proudly announced that there were whole days when he didn't accomplish any work at all. But taken as a whole, what with the house building, the housekeeping, the farming, the writing, and the occasional odd job, Thoreau's first year at the pond was jam-packed. We talked about crops, and it's obvious that Thoreau was eating well while living at the pond. Along with the produce that he grew, he would purchase groceries in town, specifically rice and molasses, two things he could not grow himself or do without. In his list of foodstuffs in Walden, he lists flour, sugar, lard, apples, dried and fresh, and sweet potatoes, as well as pumpkin and watermelon, which he listed as experiments which failed. I assume these are things that either failed to grow or didn't keep fresh for any extended period of time. As it was, the sandy soil of Walden Woods was really only good for beans. And as various farmers were fond of telling him, he began his garden too late in the season for much to thrive other than beans. The bean crop was not only for Thoreau to eat, but also, quote, to earn $10 or $12 by some honest and agreeable method. He grew 12 bushels of beans and 18 bushels of potatoes that first year and sold most of it. His whole income from his farm, as he called it, was $23.44, and he proudly bragged that this was, quote, doing better than any farmer in Concord that year. We know that Thoreau made a common New England bread using equal rights rye and cornmeal, called rye and Injun in the 19th century. And this was an experiment that I successfully tried myself in the wood stove at the Thoreau House replica at Walden Pond. He also ate a lot of rice, so much in fact that Thoreau noted, quote, it was fit that I should live on rice mainly, who lived so well the philosophy of India. And no doubt he ate a lot of beans as well. He also reports in his journal that in the fall of 1845, he collected half a bushel of chestnuts for that winter, which he boiled before eating. So yes, Thoreau did enjoy meals at home with his family and friends while he was living at Walden Pond. Non-Thoreauvians like to point this out as if Henry was somehow living a lie by eating out with his friends. He mentions these arrangements in the book, that his dining out was something he had, quote, always done and would no doubt continue to do in the future. He did not view this as hypocritical, nor was he secretive about his visits home. Why would he be? But over the years, this dining out with friends has become raiding the family cookie jar, or the ever popular, and I read this once, bounding through the fields every time the Emersons' dinner bell would ring. And let's not forget my personal favorite piece of Thoreauvian lore. Henry would steal pies from his neighbors' windowsills. This last rumor is just the one that will not die. It has been told to me on so many occasions that when I originally was writing this lecture back in 2008, a older gentleman who was living in Concord at the time said to me, I was just telling my wife that Thoreau was a ne'er-do-well who stole pies from his neighbors. So where do these stories come from? Like a lot of history, they are cherished stories that have been passed down through the years, stories that aren't necessarily true, but somehow have the ring of truth to them. Stories along the lines of Betsy Ross and the First Flag, or Paul Revere shouting the British are coming. These are stories that just don't seem to go away. And no doubt some people in Concord of 1845 did believe that Thoreau was
I can't hear you. Oh, and we still can't hear you, Richard.
And a tax evader and a woods burner. Stealing pies would not be beyond him.
We missed everything past 1845.
Okay. No doubt some people in Concord of 1845 did believe that Thoreau was indeed a stealer of pies. His reputation in mid-19th century Concord was, as we have seen, one of someone on the fringe of society. So it was probably believed by some that Thoreau did indeed steal pies. After all, he was a jailbird and a tax evader and a woods burner, so stealing pies would not be beyond him. Some people believe, kind of rightly so, that Thoreau was a vegetarian, but at Walden, he pretty much was not. Granted, at this stage in his life, he was eating very little meat, but he lists among his groceries at Walden Pond pork, and even notes that while living at the pond, he would sometimes catch a mess of fish for his dinner. And then there's this quote: "Once I went so far as to slaughter a woodchuck which ravaged my bean field and devour him, partly for experiment's sake." He reported that it had a musky flavor, but that it only afforded him, quote, "a momentary enjoyment." So what about the woodchuck? Did he really eat it? In 1880, Joseph Hosmer, a neighbor, wrote that Thoreau did indeed catch a woodchuck, but that he let it go. In fact, according to Hosmer, Thoreau didn't want to do anything too severe to the beast because of his philosophy of wanting to, quote, "not take the life of anything that breathed," unquote. So Thoreau carefully took the creature in his arms and carried it 2 miles away before he released it. I tend to believe this story to a certain point. Thoreau probably did catch and release a woodchuck. But Hosmer's story is a little bit too St. Francis of Assisi-like for me. In later years, Thoreau was almost certainly a vegetarian, but he would eat meat on occasion, especially on his excursions to the mountains when he would pack salt pork. And also in later years, he had given up the killing of animals such as birds for study, preferring a spyglass to a gun. But this attitude towards animals was only beginning during his Walden sojourn. So Hosmer's story to me is more of his ideal Thoreau than what Henry was truly like while at the pond. So I think that Thoreau did indeed eat the woodchuck. If he says he did it, then I think he did. His almost strict vegetarianism did not come until a few years later. By the 1850s, Thoreau would rarely eat meat, as chronicled in his journal in 1853, quote, "Left to my chosen pursuit, I should never eat meat." But his friend, Moncure Conway, noted that later that Thoreau sometimes did eat meat in order not to cause inconvenience to his family. So beginning in his Walden years, Thoreau would try to keep what he called a low diet. But while he was living at Walden, he was not yet quite the strict vegetarian that he would become. Speaking of animals, another little known fact about Thoreau's time at the pond is that in the spring of 1847, he was asked by Louis Agassiz to collect animal specimens for Agassiz to study. So Thoreau caught and sent off to Harvard College pouts, perch, breams, minnows, several kinds of tortoise, a black snake, some shiners, and, amazingly, a live baby fox, all to the delight of Agassiz, who even went so far as to keep the fox as a pet in his Cambridge backyard. At the time, Thoreau seemed to have no qualms about capturing these specimens, but in later years he would comment that he felt badly about the killing of animals for research. But since it was done in the name of science, the killing at least wasn't done in vain. By the end of his first year at the pond, Thoreau was living quite comfortably in his self-built house, and that is exactly what he called his abode.
Hopefully he'll come back.
Or for that matter, all over New England.
Richard, we lost you again. So I think you said abode. Was that the last word?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So he called his abode a house. And it's the exact same kind of house you would have seen all over Concord and all over New England, except for the size. It was a English cottage architectural style. And his house has been called many things over the years, but more often than not, it is referred to as a cabin. Even the stone columns that mark the house site at Walden Pond say site of Thoreau's cabin. And many visitors go to the pond are expecting to see exactly that, a pioneer style Lincoln log house. But Thoreau, along with most New Englanders, was probably not familiar with log cabins. And in 1845, Massachusetts hadn't been a frontier for over 200 years. And even then, log cabins had not been constructed by the Bay Colony's early settlers. The log cabin ideal that we think of, such as Abraham Lincoln's log cabin, was strictly a Western phenomenon. And by Western, I mean 18th and 19th century Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. New Englanders just did not build log cabins. More often than not, Thoreau himself referred to his home as a house. And in his first journal entry at the pond, he wrote, "My house makes me think of some mountain houses I have seen, which seem to have fresher auroral atmosphere about them as, I fancy, of the halls of Olympus." And a couple of days later, he added, "Verily, a good house is a temple, pure and undefiled." So he almost always called his home a house. But he did refer to it in other terms. He called it a homestead, a cabin, a hut, a lodge, an apartment, and a dwelling. His family called it a hut, as did Emerson and his family. Ellery Channing called it a wooden inkstand, and Bronson Alcott usually called it a hermitage, although one time in his journal, he called it a wigwam. In Walden, Thoreau mentions that he had 25 or 30 souls with their bodies at once under my roof. 10 by 15 can be a little crowded, but I can honestly say that it can be done because I have done it on numerous occasions while entertaining school groups. A 10 by 15 house doesn't seem all that small, actually, even when you have a crowd inside of it. When Thoreau started to build his house in March of 1845, he stated that he borrowed an axe in order to do so. Common belief is that the axe belonged to Bronson Alcott, and Alcott said that it was his axe in 1880. But several others claimed to be the lender, including, no surprise, Ellery Channing. Some have suggested it was actually Emerson's axe that Thoreau borrowed. But several accounts, however, all point to Bronson Alcott as the owner of the axe. And in 1880, Mr. Alcott wrote, "When he projected the Walden cabin, he came to me and said, 'Mr. Alcott, lend me an axe.' And with this, he built the temple of a grand primeval man." And the rest, of course, is history. As you can see, the story of Thoreau's first year at Walden Pond is, like any good story, a combination of fact and fancy, nonfiction and mythology. In my mind, the real story of the real Henry Thoreau is much more interesting than the stories and rumors that surround his 2-year sojourn. But I also come to realize that Thoreau himself is responsible for this fictionalized Thoreau that most people know because he himself idealized his sojourn in parts of Walden. Historians have always grappled with this problem. How much of Thoreau in Walden is Henry Thoreau, and how much is just a character named Henry Thoreau? So really, it's no wonder that some people, including myself many years ago, go to Walden Pond for this first time expecting some sort of Middle Earth Valhalla transcendental experience. But once the reality of the play sets in, do we love Walden Pond or Thoreau any less? Certainly not. I'm going to tell one last story, and this comes from his friend Frederick Willis, who visited Walden in 1847, and it goes like this. Henry was talking to Mr. Alcott of the wildflowers in Walden Woods when suddenly stopping, he said, "Keep very still and I will show you my family." Stepping quickly outside the cabin door, he gave a low, curious whistle. Immediately, a woodchuck came running towards him from a nearby burrow. With varying note, yet still low and strange, a pair of gray squirrels were summoned and approached him fearlessly. With still another note, several birds, including two crows, flew towards him, one of the crows nestling upon his shoulder. He fed them all from his hand, taking food from his pocket, and petted them gently for our delighted gaze, and then dismissed them by different whistling, always strange and low and short, each little wild thing departing instantly at hearing its special signal. So how much of this really happened? How much is mythology or simply an old man misremembering? In this one story, we have all the elements that have created both an idealized and a real Henry Thoreau over the years. Did this event really occur at Walden? Or is it just some Thoreau myth building, a charming story by an old man about a long dead friend? Is the real Henry Thoreau even in this story? Does it really matter? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Ellen Fenton. She would like to know the details of his love life. And she understands that he fell in love with the Unitarian minister's daughter from Cohasset.
That's it. That's the answer. So, after he had graduated from Harvard in 1837 and returned home, he was living at home with his mom and dad and brother and sisters. A young lady named Ellen Sewell was visiting relatives in Concord for the summer. And a lot of the young men in Concord, which was a very small town, so all the boys were very excited about this new girl in town. And the Thoreau brothers were two of those boys. And they both spent a lot of time with Ellen, and John actually proposed to her at one time, and she said yes. But then a short time later, she wrote him a letter saying that she could not marry John. And so then Henry wrote her a letter asking if she would marry him. And she wrote back a letter saying that no, she could not marry him. She eventually married a Unitarian minister. I think what happened was, her dad, being a Unitarian minister, probably thought the Thoreau boys were a little too transcendental for his daughter. So I think dad said no, as opposed to Ellen herself saying no. Supposedly later on his deathbed, somebody mentioned Ellen. Henry said, "I have always loved her." And he actually remained friends with Ellen and was friends with her husband as well. Osgood was his last name, and they lived in Cohasset, and they're buried in Cohasset as well. I've been to their graves. So yeah, so that's supposedly the one great true love of Henry's life.
Oh. I have something I'd like to ask Richard.
Sure, go ahead.
Richard, hi. Well, I'm interested in the Concord environment at the time, and how. Well, there were really two Concords in my mind, and you know, when we say Concordians at that time, we mean, you know, the Emerson group and Alcott's, and maybe not so much Hawthorne, but Ellery Channing and the people who really understand what Henry was doing, or at least came to understand. And then there was the rest of the town who I think didn't understand at all. And I think because when May Alcott writes about the Concordians, she really hated the Concordians, but she wasn't talking about Emerson and Thoreau and those folks. It was like there were two different groups of the people. Because when she moved to Europe, she didn't want to kind of come home because she used to say, "I can't stand the Concordians." And she wasn't talking about the ones we know.
Well, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
There was, you know, there was the transcendental Concord with all of our beloved eccentrics and weirdos.
Right. Right.
Then there were the shopkeepers and the farmers and
Right.
the blacksmiths and the lawyers and the doctors.
Right. Right.
You know, Emerson himself was able to kind of have a foot in both of those worlds.
Right. Mhm.
But he was also a member of the social circle.
Right.
He had a nice big house. But yeah, Thoreau was considered kind of a strange ne'er-do-well by most of the Concordians. Certainly the Alcotts were considered the weirdest little family of all.
But those other Concordians cannot have read. I mean, anybody who read Walden would have understood that he was not an idle ne'er-do-well. And so what I'm trying to figure out is the origin of all of these ideas that later turned into part of the myth and stereotypical version of Thoreau that still exists today. Because I know from my own research, reading magazines and things from the next generation, anybody, just for profit, anybody who bumped into any Alcott on the street wrote an article about it in some magazine because they were so famous. And so they would recite these memories that didn't really happen or that were exaggerated. And don't you think that's probably what happened with Thoreau as well? And probably the descendants of the people who didn't understand them in Concord. That had to have been like the origin, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Bob Gross's new book, The Transcendentalist of the World, kind of touches on that a little bit. And he talks a little bit about that, how, Thoreau and the other transcendentalists they weren't looked down upon, but they were certainly considered a little strange by hardworking farmers. One of my favorite stories is Thoreau was staring into a big puddle looking at minnows or tadpoles or something. This farmer was going out to the field, and there's Thoreau staring at this puddle, and later the farmer's coming back for his noonday meal, and Thoreau's still standing there. And the farmer's thinking, doesn't this guy have anything better to do? They certainly were, by proper Concord standards, they were a little strange.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Sure. Great talk.
Thank you, Kat. So we have Edward Williamson says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And Alan Rower says, great talk. I never tire. Interesting talk on a cold night. Oh, Alan, thank you, Richard, for an interesting talk on a cold night.
My pleasure. So I hope the glitches weren't too bad.
No,
it was just a couple of little glitches. That's fine. Yeah.
So I think that if there's no more questions, we can pretty much wrap it up, but I would absolutely like
Richard, can I ask one quick one?
Of course.
I was just going to say, mentioning the different classes and so forth in Concord, in some ways, and it could just be my prejudice in reading them, don't you think that he had a foot in the camp of the farmers and the African Americans and the railroad workers? And he talks about that poor Irish boy and little kid going to school, and he's not like a Harvard elitist kind of guy either.
No, you're exactly right. Over the years, I think that we've gotten a better understanding of Thoreau. He was way more connected to Concord than we give him credit for. And he actually liked hanging out with, he called them the worthies of Concord. And these were people like the farmers and the muskrat hunters and the shopkeepers and the blacksmiths and people like that. He really liked talking to those kind of people because he liked to find out, for instance, he liked talking to farmers because, especially the old farmers, they knew a lot about the seasons, they knew a lot about crops, they knew a lot about plants, and he was kind of picking their brain about that stuff all the time. He would always comment on cattle coming and going. He would talk about the muskrat hunters and how they would go about their business when he'd see them on the river in their boats and in the swamps. So yeah, he really enjoyed talking to what we would call the common people of Concord, including the Irish, including African Americans like the Garrisons. So yeah, he's not the Harvard snob that some people think that he was. In fact, he wasn't a Harvard snob at all. If anything, he kind of wanted to disassociate himself with Harvard as much as he could. We kind of get the impression that Emerson was a bit of a Harvard snob. People like Longfellow, James Russell Lowell, all the Brahmin of Boston, they were Harvard snobs. Thoreau never was one of those at all, and he liked talking to the everyday people. And everyday people is not his term, it's what I'm saying. He liked the common folk of Concord very much so, yep.
We do have one more question. Amity Wilczek says, you mentioned Thoreau's famous night in jail, but are there any other important events from Henry's first year that you're surprised did not make it into his book? And why do you think he might have left those events out?
So he only mentions going to, he went to Maine for 2 weeks in 1846. He only mentions that in passing. I think that he didn't put those in Walden because he wrote a lecture and then an essay about going to Maine. And maybe in his mind, he was saving the jail stuff for a later date, which he worked on after he left the pond. I think that going to Maine for 2 weeks and going to jail, maybe in his mind, it kind of interrupted the narrative of living at Walden Pond. So I think that's probably the main reason why he didn't add that stuff. And he just worked those up in later essays and lectures.
And if you don't mind, we have one more question here. Jacqueline Cluft asks, well, first she thanks you. So, and then she says, I hope someday you make a book of your lectures. One question, where does one find Sam Staples' account of Thoreau's arrest?
I've only seen it in biographies of Thoreau. So, but I would think that the original is probably in the Concord Library Special Collections, possibly. That's where I would think it would be, but I've only ever seen it in books about Thoreau. So I've never seen the actual document itself, but I'll bet you they have it at the Special Collections at the Concord Library.
Okay, so that's all of the questions in the chat.
Thank you for everybody. We had quite the crowd. I was very impressed. So thank you so much for everybody who joined us. And I would love to thank the Jenks Center for hosting me yet again for another lecture. And hopefully we can do it again in person sometime next summer.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.